thank Pedro for bringing me out here. In the neighborhood, we know him as Planet X. And when I say neighborhood, I don't mean like any kind of tough east side neighborhood we're from. I actually mean our fantasy football league. Pedro was a good friend of mine, so good that he was a pallbearer for both of my parents. So thank you for organizing this event, bringing folks out here, and being part of this conversation. I appreciate being here. I just came from 5 different cities doing a version of this talk. And Pedro, when he was first setting this up, I said, what version do you want? Because I have the version that districts pay me to do. Versions that sort of like racial relations conferences ask me to do. And then I have different versions. So he said, no, you should just be yourself. So you're going to get sort of the more myself version of this talk. It's a talk called From Coping to Hoping. Teaching youth to thrive through trauma. And a lot of this work is based off of the work that was first introduced to our think group by Duncan-Andrade. When I was at UCLA, the title of my dissertation was Teach Like Our Lives Depend on It. Because we understood intuitively that education was a matter of life and death. And it was something we understood in our gut, and in our heart, and in our minds, and in our souls. And it wasn't until Jeff started looking into the research inside in the health sciences that we started looking at the health sciences to start informing our work as teachers. So a lot of the work that I will be sharing with you today is going to be based on his piece in the Harvard Ed Review called Note to Educators, Hope Required when Growing Roses from Concrete. And what he did in that piece was release a framework for teaching critical hope in the face of false hope. And so what I do with this talk is to talk about that concept, or operationalizing that concept from a teaching point of view, so that you will get a practitioner-based analysis of how to actually teach you to go from maladaptive coping to critical hoping and teaching them to thrive through trauma. So this idea of going from coping to hoping, teaching you to thrive through trauma, has to acknowledge the fact that trauma exists in our minds, or trauma exists in our brains. And so I want to go ahead and cite Philippine national scholar Renato Constantino, who wrote a book once called The Making of the Filipino. And he also wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Filipino. The Miseducation of the Filipino was an allusion to the 1933 classic by Carter G. Woodson called The Miseducation of the Negro. And what Renato Constantino said in The Miseducation of the Negro was that the most effective means of subjugating a people is to capture their minds. And you've heard similar quotes by Steve Biko, South African apartheid abolitionist, who once said the most effective, the most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. Indian scholar or fiction writer Arundhati Roy also wrote once that there's a war going on that teaches us to admire our conquerors and despise ourselves. So essentially, what this acknowledges is that the most effective way to control the masses is to control how we what? Think. Right, so we got to think about how are we taught to think, right? Because in our brains and in our minds is where our experiences exist. So if we turn to the work of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they talk about our minds or our brains as our consciousness. And what they argue is that our consciousness is shaped based on the material and social conditions of our lives. So when I think about the title, Coping to Hoping, Teaching You to Thrive Through Trauma, a lot of how you're going to interpret that title is going to be based on your ideological positioning. So you could be a Freudian scholar and you'll understand these concepts through psychotherapy, let's just say. I'm not a Freudian scholar. I'm an anti-colonial educational scholar. And to be anti-colonial, we have to understand how colonialism exists. Because colonialism is the material conditions of our lives. So if you think about the different ways that colonialism exists, and you look at a lot of the work by Chairman Omali Yeshitela of the African People's Socialist Party, who wrote a book called points out how in 1337 to 1341, there was this phenomenon in Europe called the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague killed roughly 50 to 70% of the population, depending on who you ask. And what does that suggest about a population if 50 to 70% of the population is dying in a place like Europe where feudalism was rampant? If 50 to 70% of the population is dying, what does that suggest about them? What's that? They're weak, maybe? What else? Unhealthy? Overcrowded? And who's not going to heal? Who's not going to develop immunity to some types of these diseases? Civilizations that lack diversity or resources, right? Or it's like you're talking about people who are poor. And a lot of the narrative around Europe is that Europe is where Western civilization came from. And so the flip side of the narrative is that the savages are where those who had civilization didn't come from. And so around this time was when all this sort of European journey took place. So there was, Omar used to tell a joke. He says, when there was this bank robber once who was asked why he robbed banks. I forgot what his name was, but this bank robber then said, it's because what? That's where the money's from. That's where the money is. So if your population is dying because you're broke, what do? You go where the money is. Just think about it this way. A lot of the narrative is that Christopher Columbus went to India for what? Spices, right? So the idea is this: if you're at home and you need to go to the neighbor's house to borrow salt, you know you're broke, right? So essentially, here you have, 500, 600, whatever years ago, folks fleeing Europe from poverty and death, going to where the money was. So they're going to Africa, they're going to America, they're going to so-called French Polynesian Islands, they're going to South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, because that's where the resources were. And after being dispossessed of resources that are inherently ours, we are now broke. And essentially, when you're broke, you go where? To where the money is. And so in sociology, they refer to that as push and pull factors. So, where am I going with this? When we talk about our consciousness, and we talk about the existence of trauma, trauma exists in our brains, trauma exists in our minds, and our brain and our minds are usually based on the material conditions of our lives. So we can't ignore the ways that history is present in the moment. So if trauma is existing, then you know it's existing in relation to these social toxins. So there's an author by the name of James, I think Garofino, who wrote a book called Raising Children in Socially Toxic Conditions. And so how you understand the notions of social toxins is going to be based on what you understand as social and what you understand as toxic. So for me, in the context of the U.S., I want to sort of talk about social toxicity through the work of this rapper named Bombay from Florida. Bombay made this argument that what's going on is not black on black violence or brown on brown violence or brown on black violence or black on black violence. What he argued was that it's crab on crab violence. And if we want to understand the social toxicity that exists in our communities, then we have to ask who put the crabs in the barrel in the first place. Because a lot of the violence that you see existing in the context of what some people have even referred to as internal colonies in the U.S. Like internal colonies being where third world people escape their homelands after having been dispossessed, then went to the U.S. to try to get back some of these resources and found themselves as third-class citizens. All right, those are internal colonies. And the sort of internal colonial condition is set up because folks put the crabs in the barrel. And the barrel isn't a crab's natural habitat. So I just want to be clear. Some people are looking at me really confused. So I just want to be clear about how this colonial situation looks. Let's just say like this. Let's just say that where I'm from, my great-grandparents, great-grandparents had a wealth of land, culture, and population and resources. Now let's just say your ancestors were totally broke. And so to alleviate your poverty and death, you decided you were going to go explore my people's homeland. And then maybe you introduced me to some disease, biological warfare, smallpox, enslavement, violence. And you jacked my peoples for all their resources. And hundreds of years later, it's now your family who's extremely wealthy, and it's my family who's extremely poor. So to alleviate myself from some of this poverty, I'm going to go to your homeland, which is based off the resources you stole from me, to try to get an education, to try to get a job, so maybe I could send some remittances home. The children in our classroom are oftentimes descendants of dispossessed people. And their trauma exists as a result of that social toxicity, the toxic contempt of colonialism. And so I say that to say this. When I do a talk on trauma, I want to be clear I want to honor Wayne Yang and Eve Tuck's work. But this isn't a damaged narrative. I'm not saying that we're damaged people. This system is damaged. This history is damaged. And by virtue of a lot of the children who still come in your class to hopefully learn, that's evidence of their willingness and ability to survive. And we need to tap into that resilience as a starting place of all learning. They might have trauma. And the fact that they're still in school is evidence that they have the strength to survive. But here's the research. So if you look at a lot of research, it suggests that so-called urban youth, and I say so-called urban because I don't like the term urban. Urban suggests poor or low-income, black and brown communities. And what that focuses on is what a people might be lacking. I like to think of ourselves as sort of dispossessed, because what that acknowledges is what's been stolen from us. So dispossessed youth show symptoms of PTSD at a rate 2 times greater than soldiers returning from war. And we know that that all communities are subject to violence. But the reality is, what the research says, low-income minority communities burden disproportionately violence. And so the research also says that it's normal, it's the norm for dispossessed communities or urban communities, for children in urban communities to either witness or experience violence. And that being the norm leads to traumatic stress, and the accumulation of traumatic stress leads to PTSD. Oh man, what happened? The Rand Corporation in Santa Monica did further research, and what they found was that urban youth, actually their database was children in South Central LA. What the Rand Corporation found was that urban youth show symptoms of PTSD at a rate greater than children in war-torn Iraq. So what's happening in urban communities? That young people are experiencing or showing symptoms of all this PTSD, right? This violence. The violence that comes is not from the people who are, so many people think, are inherently violent. It's not like urban youth are inherently violent. A lot of the violence that you see being used in urban communities come as a result of the history of violence and vertical violence that has been imposed on them. And so the violence that you see is in essence part of a historical and military tactic to keep people oppressed when you isolate them in a community and have them fight for limited resources. Because when you're broke, when you're broke, you're going to do whatever you can to get money. You're like, I'm going to sell a little dope here. I'm going to get my little side hustle there. I'm going to jack someone there. And it's not like people want to jack. It's that people have to jack to eat. Right? So, and that type of violence is a product of this history of violence we've been subjected to. Just to be clear. All right, so then the languaging that's coming out of the Harvard School of Public Health and Stanford School of Public Health is beginning to call a lot of this trauma complex PTSD. And so complex is really compound, and post is really permanent. And what that really says is, it's not like young people have the resources to cope with their trauma. So you might go through something, whatever form of trauma, any form of violence, whether you're witnessing, verbal abuse, emotional violence, spiritual violence, cultural violence, sexual violence, physical violence. And you're either a witness or it's your direct experience. And it's not like you have urban youth, so-called urban youth, have the resources to cope with their trauma, so it doesn't go away. It doesn't get treated. You don't heal. And they sort of continue upon their life, and they might have experienced that when they were 4. And at 8, might have witnessed or experienced some more violence. 12, witnessed or experienced some more violence. 13, witnessed some more violence. And none of those were treated, and they don't go away. So it becomes compounded. And if it doesn't go away, then it's permanent. So what you're really dealing with, a lot of times, are with young people who are experiencing compounded permanent traumatic stress syndrome. And then if you look at the work of all kinds of people, what they're beginning to call, it's called intergenerational trauma. The research around intergenerational trauma first did studies on Holocaust survivors and the descendants of Holocaust survivors. Much needed research. But what wasn't done and what wasn't looked at was what intergenerational trauma might have looked like in Latino communities, African American communities, Asian and Pacific Islander communities, almost as though our suffering did not matter. But someone who treated our suffering as though it mattered is this woman by the name of Joy DeGruy-Libby. She wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. To talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is also referred to as historical loss syndrome. And historical loss syndrome is a symptom of trauma by people who have a history of losing population, land, and culture. And so, in her construct of post-traumatic slave syndrome, she uses this analogy to illustrate what one of those symptoms might look like in the African American community. So she says you can take an African American mother who lives next door to a European American mother. This African American mother will ask the African American mother will ask the European American mother, "How's Johnny?" And then the European American mother will say, "Johnny is great. He's the captain of the football team. He doesn't have as many touchdowns as he did last year, but he's having a wonderful season. He was accepted into Cal, but he wasn't accepted into Stanford, but we're so proud of him. Johnny, he has a girlfriend now. She's beautiful. They're already set up to go to prom. We can't wait. And we bought him a gold Jetta. He wanted a black one, but it wasn't available. But it's a really cute car." The European American mother will then ask the African American mother, "Well, how's Jonathan?" The African American mother will then say, "Well, Jonathan, he's doing okay. Jonathan, he's also a captain of the football team. He's the linebacker on defense. He has way more tackles than he did last year, but not as many as we expected. He was accepted into Harvard, but he didn't get into Princeton, Emory, or Yale. We're kind of disappointed about that. He also has a girlfriend, but we don't quite like how she wears her hair, so we don't know what that'll look like at prom. And we bought him a black Honda Accord, even though we wanted red, so we're not altogether happy with what's going on." Joy DeGruy-Libby suggests that that is a symptom of post-traumatic slave syndrome. And post-traumatic slave syndrome exists because you know that millions of enslaved Africans experienced and witnessed violence. So it's safe to say that they have some form of traumatic stress, if not PTSD. And that this PTSD, it's safe to assume if their life is treated with less value, then these enslaved Africans didn't get treatment for their trauma. And so intergenerational trauma, because trauma experts around trauma understand that the strongest vessel of trauma are parents. So it's passed on. And what she says is that this trauma, the trauma that exists in the African American community comes as comes as a result of African people's direct relationship with European enslavement and European colonialism. Because the European slave master will come into the enslaved African slave quarters and ask the African mother about her daughter, about her son, and say, wow, Jonathan looks like he's growing up. He's getting taller, his muscles are beginning to develop, he looks like he's becoming an adult. And the African mother will have to say, no, Jonathan's kind of clumsy, he's not as smart as his size might suggest, he's kind of dumb. Because she was trying to do what? Protect him from working in the fields of being sold, and to try to spend a little bit more time before her child is sold off to slavery. The same enslaved African mother will be asked by the European slave master, well, how's Joanna? She looks like she's growing up. She's growing taller, she's beginning to develop. Has she had her menstrual cycle yet? And the African mother will have to say, no, she's also not developed. She hasn't had her menstrual cycle yet, and her hips are kind of narrow. Because she was trying to protect her daughter from being what? Being raped and bred. And so what she argues is that the self-degradation and the self-doubt and the self-hate that you see in the African American community today could be traced back to the unconscious or to the conscious coping mechanisms dealing with white supremacy in the context of slavery that have now developed into unconscious defense mechanisms that we have descendants of African American people have internalized because the trauma has gone untreated for hundreds of years. So all that to make the case that trauma exists. Trauma exists as a direct result of our oppression. And what happens in our brain, according to Bruce Perry, author of Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, that it's not that children are in our classroom not paying attention to what we're teaching. Because I know that many of you in here are like the bomb teacher. But sometimes we have children who aren't paying attention to what we teach. And so what Bruce Perry argues is that it's not that children aren't paying attention to our teaching. It's that physiologically they have a hyperactive stress response system that forces them to pay attention to factors in the room that can cause them more stress. And so if you know something about the amygdala or the limbic system, then you know that the amygdala doesn't know the difference between real or imagined threat. So if for whatever reason I think, that because you look a certain way, you dress a certain way, you walk a certain way, you speak a certain way, or your expressions look a certain way, I might connect that to an imaginary threat that was once a real threat. And so you have young people in the classroom who might look at somebody across the classroom and say, damn, that fool thinks he's hard, he ain't harder than me. Right? In the positions of powerlessness, fighting for limited resources, you socially construct notions of power. Right? We call it social capital or cultural capital. So he's thinking, my sense of power, I'm not going to get paid, my sense of power is going to come from my ability to intimidate somebody. I know he ain't harder than me. And right, so I'm thinking, oh, that person right there is the cousin of so-and-so over there, and I don't really get along with folks from the 50s. Oh, she thinks she's cute. She's not cuter than me. Oh, that dude thinks he's smart. He's not smarter than me. So we have all these things going on in our stress response system that prevent us from paying attention to teaching because physiologically our stress response system is forcing us to pay attention to factors in the room that could cause us more stress. And then Victor Camangian at Stanford essentially shows through his work that trauma, when gone unaddressed, thrives with avoidance. Right? That it intensifies when we don't examine or seek to understand the traumatic emotions. So this slide I got right here, I got from a good friend of mine, a mentee, and now a co-teacher, Shireen Hannigan-Martinez. She did this slide when she was a student of mine at the University of San Francisco as part of her teacher action research. I just changed it a little. And while I acknowledge her, she invited me to co-teach with her at Castlemont this year. And I really appreciate the invitation. And I want to acknowledge the students of ours who came today for coming, hearing me lecture, when a lot of times I feel like you have a hyperactive stress drive and I'm trying to teach you in class. Or you're just not paying attention. And so a lot of what she showed in her work, a lot of what Shireen showed in her work is that trauma doesn't always lead to PTSD. And that one of the strongest protective factors against the risk of social toxins is loving adult relationships. And so the way she conceptualizes it is through what she's calling compañera love. I'm not a compañera, so I'm just calling it loving relationships. And so the way I understand loving relationships is through a lot of educational research. It's been talked about by Nell Noddings as personal caring, Tyrone Howard as cultural caring, Angela Valenzuela talks about it as authentic caring, and then Eric Betzstein talks about the importance of political relationships. For the purpose of this talk, I want to cite someone else who is a social worker at the University of Texas, Austin, by the name of a woman by the name of Brene Brown. Brene Brown talked about relationships in this way in a book she recently released called Courage to Dare. Courage to Dare is an abridged talk, is online, called Power of Vulnerability. And what she said, she interviewed thousands of people. And what she found was that what was emerging were these people who had a sense of love and belonging in their life. And what she said, what she wanted to find out is what is the one quality those who had the most love and belonging had in their life? What did they have? And what she found was that those who had the most love and belonging in their life believed they deserved love and belonging. That's it. Those who had the most love and belonging in their life believed they deserved love and belonging. And that those who had love and belonging had courage. And that courage, based on the root word kur, which is heart. And courage was the ability and willingness to tell your story with your whole heart. Those who had, and she said, those who had the most connection were those who had the willingness to tell their story with their whole heart. And they also had the courage to be imperfect. And because they had the courage to be imperfect, they had the courage to allow others to be imperfect. And that allowed them to be vulnerable. And it's vulnerability and connection that allows those with the most love and belonging in their life to have love and belonging. So when I say that to say, we're talking about teaching youth to thrive through trauma, a lot of it is going to have to be based on the relationships we build with young people. And a lot of the times, if we want them to sort of heal from their trauma, we're going to ask them to go to places they might not have been asked to go before by teachers. And a lot of times they don't go to these places with teachers because teachers themselves won't go there. And what we need to do is engage in that shared vulnerability. So I use that slide to set this up. To honor that old adage that young people don't care how much their teachers know until what? Until they know how much their teachers care. You can't get the relationship stuff right, and nothing else really matters. All right, so once we establish a relationship, then we can teach them what we know. And so part of what we want them to know is how to thrive. And so, I pick up this concept from Ginwright, who wrote a book called Black Youth Rising. In Black Youth Rising, he theorized this concept called radical healing. And in radical healing, he drew on the work of Virginia O'Leary. Virginia O'Leary says that there's 4 responses one can have as a result of an adverse experience. The first response, the first level of functioning one could experience after experiencing a traumatic event is what she called submission. It's sort of when you just fall apart. You give in. You experience a traumatic event and you quit. The second level of functioning one might experience after a traumatic event is what she calls survival. And survival, is best captured by Talib Kweli's "Just to Get By." We talked about we smoke and we drink and we dance and we kick it. We post just to get by. We're just trying to make it. Dealing with all this stuff, man, I need to drink. We're dealing with all this stuff, man, I need to smoke. Right? We're just trying to survive. The next level of functioning that one might experience after experiencing a traumatic event is recovery or resilience. This happens when you finally operate at the level you were operating at prior to experiencing a social trauma. But where we want to help young people go is to thrive. It's where you get stronger as a result of your traumatic event. Right? It's when you find strength as a result of enduring through your struggles. It's when you find purpose after examining your pain. It's when you say, I'm not going to give in. I'm not going out like that. I'm going to win. Right? Because I'm not the one. That's thriving. And the way I think about this is through the work of Tupac Shakur. I was Tupac on top of my clock. And when I taught in LA at Crenshaw High School, and I tell people that Tupac usually stayed on top of my clock because I always felt like he told us what time it was. In So Many Tears, Tupac begins by saying, back in elementary, I thrived on misery. Left us alone, I grew up amongst the dying breed. Inside my mind, I couldn't find a place to rest until I put that thug life tatted on my chest. Let me just show you how these concepts fit in to Tupac's lyrics. So part of what I look at is cultural studies. Cultural studies tells you that art and the world is a text. So as far as I'm concerned, Tupac is a scholar. Apparently I'm not alone. So Tupac, he says, so think about it. He goes, back in elementary, I thrived on misery. Left me alone when I grew up amongst other young people who live just like me. Right? This is that young person in your class. Back in elementary, I thrived on misery. They're in your class, hypervigilant, depressed, detached, sad, or ready to go. Left me alone, I grew up amongst other young people who live just like me. Inside our head, inside our minds, we couldn't find a place to rest. We were restless, not quite present, not here, thinking about the past, hoping for something better in the future. Inside our minds, we couldn't find a place to rest until I put that thug life tatted on my chest. Thug life is an acronym. Raise your hand if you know what it's an acronym for. Ask Lane. What's thug life an acronym for? What is it? Say it loud.
The hate you give little infants fucks everyone.
The hate you give little infants F's fucks everyone. So think about it. He said, and that's an important concept. It's a very important concept. Inside my mind, I couldn't find a place to rest until I put that thug life tatted on my chest. And thug life is an acronym that stands for the hate you give little infants fucks everyone. And the importance of that concept is that it shifts the narrative. That so many young people internalize these narratives that it's their fault. So they walk around, they're in class, and they think to themselves, I'm failing because it's my fault. I'm just dumb. I'm hungry, I'm poor. It's my fault because I'm from South LA. I'm from East Oakland. I'm ugly and I'm not attractive because it's my fault that I got brown skin. Nobody likes the way I speak because it's my fault that my mom has a thick Filipino accent. We internalize these narratives that we become victims to. And what this does is it turns the attention to the real problem. And you externalize the narrative. Inside my mind, I couldn't find a place to rest until I realized this system is a problem. This history of colonialism that has dispossessed my people from resources that inherently mine that kept us broke, and that's the reason we fight. That's the problem. This media, this corporate media that's imposing on us this notion of masculinity, this notion of femininity, this notion of success that's at odds with the history and dignity of my people, that's the problem. Inside my mind, I couldn't find a place to rest until I realized, you guys, this system's a problem. And so I look at Tupac, and it makes me think about the significance of tattoos. And despite what a lot of you might imagine as you look at me standing in front of you, this is not me. And I have to pause every now and then when I show this because people start giggling and it triggers all this excitement. This is Tupac, the great Tupac Amaru Shakur, with that sort of chiseled chin, deep, dark eyes, long eyelashes, thick eyebrows. He's complex, right? He got a little touch of femininity, but he's hard as hell. But if you look at the significance of tattoos, you can look at the work of David Kirkland. Is Kati, are you in here? Homebrew Kati de los Rios, who's studying at Teachers College, hit me to David Kirkland's work. And David Kirkland wrote a piece called The Skin We Ink, to look at the implications tattoos among young black men might have for educators. And so what he did is he interviewed young black men in Michigan. And what he found was that young black men in Michigan felt like schools were successful at silencing their voices. They were so successful at silencing young black men's voices that it didn't allow them to articulate and express their humanity. And so rather than submitting to this silencing, they decided they were going to create spaces on their own that would allow them to articulate and express their humanity. And those spaces was the skin that they inked. And so what David Kirkland found was that tattoos connect personal stories to larger social ones. So what does that mean for teachers as we design our lessons, as we choose our curriculum, as we design our assessment? How can we help young people do personal work that allows them to connect, that connects them to larger social ones? How are we teaching in ways that connect them to something larger than themselves? Another thing David Kirkland found was that tattoos speak not only to how one uses words, but how one perceives as possible. What are we doing in our classroom that allows young people to start seeing a future beyond the one that exists? What are we doing to cultivate their imagination, to start letting them believe that it doesn't have to be this way? And lastly, what he found was that tattoos for these young black men allowed them to cope with the pain that they were dealing with, connect with other young people who were experiencing pain just like them, and to develop a social commentary to shift the narrative of the society that has deemed them unimportant. This is the last theoretical frame I'm going to use. It's in this book. I got this from studying this book called Healing Trauma. It was curated by Daniel Siegel at UCLA. And so it's commonly agreed upon that there's a right side of the brain and a left side of the brain. But what's not agreed upon is whether or not cognitions are isolated to the right side or left side of the brain. And what that means essentially is this. That it's commonly thought of that the left side of the brain is the creative side of the brain, and the right side of the brain, the left side of the brain is the math side, the logical side of the brain, and then the right side of the brain is the creative side of the brain. But those who, a lot of neurobiologists will argue that if you're a musician, you're not simply using the cognitions on the right side of your brain, because you're still using some rational, logical thinking skills. So what's happening is that skill is actually lateralized. Same thing with those who do math. A lot of that requires creative thinking, so this thinking is lateralized. What's not disagreed is where trauma exists and where trauma is re-experienced. Trauma is re-experienced in the right side of our brains. So, when it goes unaddressed, it intensifies. And so the thing about the brain is that it's always seeking to be whole. But and there's a bundle of nerves called the corpus callosum that separates the right side and the left side of the brain. It's billions of nerves that sort of cognitions have to pass through. But when we don't have an opportunity to explore or examine our trauma, then it doesn't have a chance to cross to the left side of our brain. The left side of our brain is where we construct narrative. But narrative therapists, narrative therapy is something that came around about 20, 25 years ago in New Zealand. And narrative therapy was used to work with a lot of the Maori community. And so you know about narrative therapy if any of you have ever gone. One time I tried to see a therapist. And I went and I found that therapy was culturally irrelevant. So I never went. Again, my homegirl Tracy Buena Vista says that someone like me doesn't need a therapist because I have really smart friends. I think she was talking about herself. But yeah, I would see, a lot of times if I'm going through something, I'm gonna check in with a homie. And it would serve like therapy. But for those of you who go to therapy, you might talk about your traumatic experiences, maybe something like this. Raise your hand if you've ever broken up or lost somebody you really love. Okay, the rest of you are lying. Right, so if you're really going through it, sometimes you just might need to check in with somebody. Sometimes it's the therapist, sometimes it's your homies. But you go, and if you're unlike me, you're going and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going through a terrible experience. This shit is fucked up. Life sucks, man. I can't do this shit. Right? That's if you're unlike me. And you might do that like 4, 5, 8, 10, 11, 12 times, right? And you're like, oh, last time, 12. And then finally on your 15th time, 17th time, 18th, 20th, 25th time, some of you, your second time, some of you right after the breakup, you're like, man, it's cool, it's whatever, dude. Man, it is what it is, and it'll be what it'll be. I'm cool, it's straight, whatever. And then, but what you're doing is you're lateralizing this grief. You're crossing it over from the right side of the brain to the left side of the brain. And you're balancing out. Rather than it being a visceral, emotional, subjective re-experiencing of trauma, you began to integrate it with some rational, logical, objective thinking. And so you're not overwhelmed by this trauma. You don't become a victim of this narrative that you've internalized. You start seeing that this experience you're having is part of a larger cultural and political context. And it allows you to recognize that you have agency within this problem. And so you start changing, right? And you start going more and more, you're talking about it. Now you're in public, so I'm, yeah, I went through this, ain't nothing, but now I'm checking out this thing called OkCupid. You're laughing because I'm talking about you. OkCupid was cool, but I'm on Match.com now. That's better. I'm gonna try to mess around with this Christian mingle. Or you're just like, whatever, man. You got any friends you can hook me up with? But what that does is you've changed it. You're no longer like, man, well, it's whatever, man. I'm not even trying to get you. I'm just trying to do me. You're not stuck in this fear, right? Because you've changed the narrative, you've constructed a narrative around this grief, around this pain, around this loss. And when you start constructing a narrative, externalizing this trauma, then you start developing narratives of hope. But we want to help young people understand that what they experience and whatever they've internalized for themselves is part of a larger political, historical context. And this allows them to get stronger as a result of the struggles they experience. And what it does is it allows them to develop hope, or what we are trying to call critical hope, which is a sense of control over your life. And rather than falling victim to this narrative that has kept them stuck, they are now rewriting the ending. And so I'm going to show you two examples of how I try to operationalize this in practice. This is about one of 6 units that I try to do over the course of a year. And our students right here had just done this unit. And the poetry they wrote was beautiful and healing and allowed them to focus on the importance of thriving. And this is the first unit of a year, and I try to have this unit because this unit allowed young people to do some self-reflection, to challenge this idea that we learn through experience. Because it's a lie that we learn through experience. We learn through experiences we choose to learn from. And so this is a unit where young people compared sanctioned poetry with spoken word poetry and did an analysis across the 2 poems, answering the question, what is the relationship between context or text, or what is the relationship between the word and the world? And they wrote 5 to 7 page comparative essays. And afterwards, they were asked to answer this question. How could you use your words to name your world to change it? How could you use your words to name the world to change it? And they wrote 3 poems and performed 1. And so the example I'm going to show you today is of a student who on the 4th day of school, I was lecturing, and I thought I was doing a great job. I thought I had him paying attention and everything. All of a sudden, I hear some voice to the left side say something like this. What the fuck you looking at, bitch? I'll beat your fucking ass. You laughing because you might have seen that too. She jumped up, she started fighting some other student. They're fighting. I thought somebody was going to break it up. Nobody broke it up. I broke it up. Security came. They took the girls. Next day we had a circle. Yeah. Are you laughing because you know what happens next? Because they fought again. And so, the circles and the interventions helped because eventually these 2 girls became friends. But the ways they started coping with their trauma was by smoking together. They come to class, I'm talking about like first or second period, they come to class high every day. We tried interventions, we tried messing up their high. Well, mess your high up. Why you high? You're disrespectful. Mess up your high. We tried to talk to families, and it didn't work. And eventually, we would hook students up with Clínica de la Raza, and they do a lot of free counseling and drug rehabilitation. And they go to the rehab situation, and they come back, and they be high on ecstasy. And you get to the point you're starting to tutor them, and she was writing her essay, typing it out while busy and rolling. Anyway, it's that student. And so I was asked to do an address in San Francisco in 2000, a few years ago. And I wanted to show an example of a student that most exemplified, student work that's culturally relevant. And so I was thinking, I said, I could use so-and-so's poem. And so I asked her, hey, do you mind if I use your poem? And she said, yeah, use my poem. And I said, cool. I went home, I watched it, and it was too damn real. So I went back to school the next day, I said, where's so-and-so? I can't find her, where's so-and-so? And they're like, oh, she's in the office, she got into a fight. I said, oh, damn. And so I went to the office, and she was standing, she was pissed, she was hyper-vigilant, she was with her mother. The other girl was there, she was pissed, she was hyper-vigilant, she was with her mother. I said, I need to talk to you real quick. So she came, she goes, okay, what? I know I got to fight, she had that in my head, what? Don't mess up my high. Anyway, I was like, no, I need to tell you something. I went home and watched your poem, and I realized I can't show it. is too serious. And she went from being mad to being sad. And I was like, I never saw students really like their work that much that they were sad and I wasn't showing it to teachers. And I said, what's wrong? And she said, I was hoping other people could learn from my experience. So I keep this example of student work as a way to honor her. It's not to communicate in ways others might assume, like us being damaged. This world is fucked up. And so I also show this, and I also tell that story as a trigger warning. So for those of you who might be triggered for whatever reason around issues of sexual assault, I want to take a couple seconds to prepare yourself mentally to not pay attention, look at your phone, or whatever you do. But this is an example of student work based on a unit where we try to teach young people to go from maladaptive coping to critical coping as a way to teach them to thrive through their trauma.
If I sit down into my head and my back flashed before my eyes, I would see the times I was small with my cousins, drinking, smacking, doing powder till my nail was too gone, cheating on my boyfriend with my ex because he would tell me he still loved me, lying to the people I love, hurting the people that care about me the most, and then I would see the reason why. I would see a little girl I was seeing a little girl getting raped at the age of 4 years old. She didn't know what to do or who to talk to. She was so afraid that she would cry and not tell anybody. She stayed silent. I would see 4 years passing by, rape after rape after rape. I would see an 8-year-old girl with more scars than birthdays. I would see a 13-year-old girl getting raped by her first real boyfriend. I would see a girl who didn't know how to love herself. I would see me. And if I had a gun put into my head and I had minutes left to live, I would tell that little girl it's okay to tell your mom. It's safe to cry. Go through your pain so you can heal. Drugs will not heal your pain, will not block it out. Love yourself. One day, trust somebody, love somebody. Let yourself be loved. If I had a gun pointed to my head, I would cry and tell 15-year-old me, I love you, don't regret your mistakes. Because I learned that my mistakes are the lesson I needed to learn self-care.
We'll text her Leather Ocean. Others might have learned from her experience. And so, the thing about teaching nowadays for me, or teaching at that time, was I had the luxury of designing the units and teaching the classes. And we also had teaching assistants. Oscar was a teaching assistant. Oscar Cardenas, the homie over there, was a teaching assistant with us. Dave was a co-teacher. David Philippan was a co-teacher with us. Colin Ihara was a teaching assistant with us. Anybody else?
Carol.
Carol, where you at? Hey, Carol! Carol was there. She was right there with us. And so when you have teaching assistants, you do the whole class instructions, you have a couple students, but you put a lot of the burden of the work on your TAs as an opportunity for them to learn how to teach. And so Shireen was this student's assigned TA. And she has a chapter coming out in Sonia Neta's new book where she describes this moment. And she describes one of her partner student, where we team up students to have each other's back, and it's their responsibility to make sure they learn and they study. And so the thing about these two was that they didn't quite get along at first. And after some of the mediation that was facilitated by Shireen, they got along. And so the day of the poetry performance came, and this student was planning on performing the poem up until the moment class began. And it was at that moment where she decided that she didn't want to perform this poem. She was going to perform something else or not perform a poem at all. And with the support of Shireen and the support of her partner, she decided to perform it because her partner said, if you perform it, I'll stand up there with you and I'll have your back. So they went up there. And as she described in her chapter, after she performed her poem, this young man, 6 foot tall, young black man next to a young Rasa girl, about 4'11", real thin, raised her hand in victory because he knew she did something that was going to make all of us stronger. And a lot of what Shireen will tell you is that this was hard work. And this work, like Jeff and I get to benefit by going up and doing talks and showing you the good stuff. But there's hours upon hours upon hours that doesn't look as appealing. That yield moments like this. So for those of you who are struggling, like myself, at times, you put in the good work and you'll yield some good results. Because for this young woman, she internalized that hegemonic notion that it was her fault. And so she had a lot of shame around her experiences, a lot of self-blame, and it compromised her self-worth. And she talked about coping with her pain through drug use, and we witnessed her coping with her pain by fighting. But for her, it was cathartic healing for her to speak her truth, because it challenged the notion that it was her fault. It challenged the notion that this was her burden to bear, that this was her scarlet letter, that I'm not going to buy into this patriarchy or misogyny that silences us from telling the truth to people who are supposed to love us. And I'm going to tell my truth, and we're going to all burden this pain. And then by burdening this pain, it's our responsibility to change it. And so for her, she was going to thrive through this trauma by learning to love herself. We'll end with this example. This is a student I taught in Los Angeles, and that on his wrist signifies rolling 60s crip. He came into my class, this tattoo right here is HK, which stands for Hoover Killer. And this student came in on day 1, 20 minutes late. So in the other story, if I was feeling myself on day 4, you know I'm feeling myself on day 1. So he comes in 20 minutes late, he's strolling in, crosses right in front of me, looks at me like, sits down. You know when you go to your staff meetings later, you go to class, your meals late, you come in like you were there the whole time. He was like, man, whatever. So I'm lecturing, I'm doing my thing, I'm back in my group, I thought I was doing a good job. This fool decides he's going to say out loud, I put that on 60s, cuz. Let me just translate. It was like, put your hand on the Bible, you promise to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. That's on, right? You put your hand on the Bible, that means on. So he said, I put that on, put whatever I'm telling you on, rolling 60s crib. I'm not put on the Bible, I'll put that on our gang, homie. He says that to his homeboy in class while I'm lecturing. And it triggered something in me that I don't suggest you do. But it's what I did based on who I am and where I'm from and how I acted in that moment. Again, I don't suggest you do this. Because I said, it triggered me, right? I said, I don't care what neighborhood you're from, intellectually or physically, I'll beat your fucking ass. Again, I don't suggest you do this. But what I do suggest is this, is that you learn how to hold young people accountable in ways they feel loved. You have to have high expectations. Just because they're going through something doesn't give you an excuse to enable their failure. It's because they come in with this strength that you tap into it and hold them personally responsible and collectively accountable. And so I finished my day one lecture, and I think he thought I held him personally responsible and collectively accountable in ways he felt loved. Because afterwards he walked out and said, I'm gonna like you, cuz. But this is him. And so he decides, and we're running this unit that we now call Doc Your Block, which is a youth participatory action research project. And so students are encouraged to, read literature we give them or research literature, what you all call a literature review. And based on your literature review, students were supposed to write a philosophy of social change. And then conduct a research project based on what that philosophy of social change would look like in your community. So this student, he turned to the work of Malcolm X, who wrote a piece called Message to the Grassroots, and Martin Luther King, who wrote a piece who delivered a speech called Beyond Vietnam. In Beyond Vietnam, Martin Luther King said, don't talk to me about the violence happening in the hood. He didn't say that. He said it like that. Don't talk to me about the violence happening in the hood when the greatest purveyor of violence is our own government. And so he also pulled out this concept of a house slave or a house Negro and a modern day Uncle Tom. And so, when you do a research proposal here at Mills or anywhere, you present your research proposal to your professor and to your class, and they give you feedback. Whether or not that's a legitimate research project. Well, he did the same thing. He did this research presentation, and they were discussing the philosophy of social change that they wanted to look at in the hood. And so they had his group, him and his homeboy and two other people, had a research question that wanted to look at what masculinity looked like in rolling 60s crip. What did masculinity look like in rolling 60s crip? And so he's presenting the philosophy of social change, and some students in the class who he would have bullied before, had we not created that loving, trustful political relationship, asked him a question. Well, don't you think that you all are hypocrites for talking about a philosophy for social change if modern day house slaves or modern day Uncle Toms are negative for the community? Aren't you a hypocrite because gangbanging is negative for the community? So this really heated dialogue went back and forth, and he just had to accept the fact that there was some truth to what they were holding him accountable to. That night, him and his homeboy showed up to one of their big homies' house. The older generation that was supposed to lead this younger generation on how to be effective gangbangers. The big homie opened up the door, the little homies came in, the big homie held his homeboy accountable for coming up short on their financial agreement. He punched him again, was holding him accountable. This student pulls out this gun, and he pulls it on the big homie's head. And he said, he's telling us this as a class. And so he has his gun. And he says that in his mind, he was thinking, I'm going to kill this fool. But what happened? What popped in his head?
Social change.
The dialogue that day that said, if you participate in gang violence, then you are a modern day Uncle Tom. And he said, I don't want to participate in the destruction of the black community. So he said, I want to participate in black solidarity. So he didn't shoot him. I was thinking to myself as he was presenting, because I was doing this during my dissertation collection year, I was thinking to myself, damn, that's some good data. I got some good data. I'm sure he was thinking the same thing, like, man, this is good data, I can't wait. I'm sure the last thing he was thinking about was his research project. And so part of what he wrote was this. If organized correctly, a GAM member's mindset is a threat, but it's exercised on the wrong problem. We're strong because of our unity. We just need some direction. All right. We just need some direction, so it's justice that will bring us together. Since we don't have power as a community, it's often misused in many ways and results in self-destruction. Finally, when you think of masculinity in the hood, there's both negative and positive. As far as I've seen in the negative, I've seen somebody get shot and die, but there are also positive effects. You get a sense of who you can become. It's like now that my knowledge is changing, I'm more interested in using the positive aspects. And this is what this young man said about the importance of using their lives as a starting place of all learning, so you can help them go from coping to hoping and teach them to thrive through trauma.
I realized that I was a slave, you know what I'm saying, but I broke those shackles though. You know what I'm saying? I just started looking at life critically, you know what I'm saying, like damn, this shit crazy. My mind is trapped, you know what I'm saying? I'm incarcerated like mentally, you know what I'm saying? I gotta break free or whatever. And then you just basically just open my eyes and you know what I'm saying, let me really find who I was and like, you know what I'm saying? Once like, you know what I'm saying, the text opened up my eyes, I seen everything. You know what I'm saying? I seen everything. I freed myself. Like I told him, like I ain't about to get caught up in this shit no more. I ain't going to jail. I'm about to use the game. I'm about to use the system to win the system. You feel me? I'm about to go to I'm about to go to school and I'm gonna stay in the hood. So you know what I'm saying? I'm about to just educate myself. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna grind here and I'm gonna grind in the hood. You know for sure I'm gonna come to school and grind because in the hood it's harder. You know what I'm saying? School can't fuck with the hood. Nothing about it. You know what I'm saying? A little bit. And that's just how it is. It helped me learn more because first I had to learn how to be myself in the class because I never did it before. You know what I'm saying? Since kindergarten on up, I never was able to be myself in class. So at first I had to really get used to being myself. And after that, you know what I'm saying, I could just take them ways and then learn like that. You know what I'm saying? I learned in school much easier, coming to school, being myself, you know what I'm saying? And using my frustrations and you know what I'm saying, you know, basically my depression sometimes, you know, when I come to school and just use it, you know what I'm saying, to write about it. You feel me? Just write about it. Just basically just be myself.
Right. So we talked about, and part of what he talked about when he did his research was he found that a lot of Rolling 60s Crip young men had joined because they were struggling through what Michael Eric Dyson calls father deprivation. And that they were longing for male role models. And that they found these male role models in the neighborhood. And the ways that they coped with their pain, the multiple layers of pain that they dealt with, was through violence. Because in the positions of powerlessness, they gained social capital by their ability to intimidate others. And he recognized that he had a slave mentality. It was using violence as a coping mechanism. And then what the readings and what studying did, when we were able to connect it to the social toxicity of their everyday lives, is it provided these young people a sense of knowledge of self. And that he says he's going to thrive by staying committed to being a positive member in the community he lived in. So I'm going to leave you all with this. Melanie Clay, where are you, Melanie? Melanie Clay cites Carl Jung in her master's thesis with the University of San Francisco. Carl Jung has this concept called wounded healer. Eduardo Duran wrote a book in 2006 called Soul Wound, to talk about the trauma existing in Native American communities. And what he talks about is the importance of wounded soul healers. And what he says is that if you work with colonized people, and you have all these fetishes about us as people, and fantasies of what we might be, and who we, you know, and all that, then you haven't healed from your own trauma. And even if you're a person of color working with others, the first thing you need to do is heal from your own wounds. And if you don't heal from your own wounds of experiencing racism, hatred of women, homophobia, heteronormativity, heteropatriarchy, we haven't learned, or we're not working to unlearn that toxicity or the impact of that trauma, then we will be perpetuators of PTSD, traumatic stress, historical, race-based, and intergenerational trauma, and we will be contributing to the learned helplessness and learned hopelessness of our students, or in their ways, clients and patients. So we need to work first on healing ourselves. Then we need to rethink this notion of cultural relevance. Because if cultural relevance isn't about the health and well-being of our children, then it's not really relevant. And we'll be up here talking about the importance of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Gloria Antalua and Audre Lorde, and they'll be sitting there thinking to themselves, what does this have to do with me? Because I'm stressed the fuck out. And all that shit you're talking is adding more stress to my life. And so this means that we have to not be afraid to go where our young people actually are. And we see shit all the time that we ignore that could be teachable moments. When we don't treat young people's lives as worthy of study. But their lives are worthy of intellectual interrogation and scholarly scrutiny. But too often, we don't even have the ability to go there with ourselves. If we can't even go there with ourselves, how in the world will we go there with others? Right. And then what Tupac says, thug life. Thug life is a movement. You know, Tupac Shakur's mom was Afeni Shakur, leader of the Black Panther Party in Brooklyn. His godmother was Assata Shakur, first woman in the United States who had a bounty on her head because she committed her life to black self-determination. His stepfather was Mutulu Shakur, a man who cured thousands of drug addicts through the use of acupuncture. His godfather was Geronimo Gijaga Pratt, who spent 28 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Tupac was incubated in social consciousness towards black self-determination. He also died at 26 when he was starting the Thug Life movement, where he was organizing gangs in New York, Chicago, Atlanta, and Los Angeles, and maybe even the Bay Area, to have a gang truce so that they could unite against the social forces that were dividing and conquering them. He said he didn't become clear with the problem. He was blaming himself until he was clear with the problem. And that's why ideological clarity and common purpose, teaching your young people that is important. And lastly, we all go through our own shit. Our young people go through their shit. And what we need to help young people learn is how to thrive through their traumas, right? That, yeah, you're going through something. I'm going through something. She's going through something. He's going through something. And we can either submit or we could use that as motivation to change it. And if you're from this community, the beauty about you being from here is you could go on the block and talk to other young people who I can't talk to. And you have the experience that many of us don't have that can help you be a part of something larger than yourself. And so that's the importance of rethinking this notion of culturally relevant teaching and critical pedagogy. If it does not start with children and what they experience and what they internalize as the starting place of all learning, then any attempts at closing the achievement gap will miss the mark. And we're in important positions because we work with young people every day. And we could either spend that time continuing to miss the mark or commit our life helping our young people change our lives. That's my work. I appreciate you coming. Thank you.